During the Holocaust, millions of people lived in Nazi hell, where they were robbed of their humanity and forced to live in unimaginable conditions. Over the course of the 1930s and early to mid-1940s, the Nazis rounded up anyone that fell outside of their perceived superior race and sent them to concentration camps, where they lived in inhumane conditions. Prisoners were dehumanized, tortured, and humiliated on a daily basis, and many wouldn't live to see the other side of the barbed wire fence. Join us on a deep dive into the unfathomable treatment people endured at the hands of the Nazi regime. This is what it was like in one day of Nazi hell. Before we get into what it was like at the camps, we need some background about who these people were. Nazis primarily targeted the Jewish people, but they also rounded up people from other groups. In the early 1930s, the camps primarily held political prisoners. These were communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other political dissidents, who were sent to camps in an attempt to wipe out any opposition. Asocials were introduced to the camps a year or so later. The term referred to anyone the party deemed undesirable, and was a pretty long list. These people were members of the LGBTQ+ community, people without housing, sex workers, the Romani people, and anyone that didn't conform to social norms at the time. Next, pacifists who refused to fight for the Nazis, and people with criminal records were sent to camps. Then Nazis turned their attention to the Jewish people. Nazis believed in the distorted ideology of racial purity, which identified some as racially superior and others as racially inferior. They spread anti-Semitism and perpetuated the twisted notion that Jews were society's enemy. The Nazi regime created a racial hierarchy known as the Aryan race, people with blonde hair and blue eyes at the top. Since Jews didn't fit this scientifically unfounded concept of a superior race, they were the party's biggest targets. In fact, Germany passed 400 anti-Semitic laws between 1933 and 1938. These laws stole Jews' basic human rights and stripped them of their German citizenship. By the end of the 1930s, people were being rounded up en masse, especially the Jews, and sent to camps to fulfill Hitler's final solution, the systemic extermination of the Jewish people. This brings us to what it would be like for someone on their first day at a concentration camp. They probably wouldn't believe how horrible these places were at first, especially since some people didn't know where they were going. Nazi propaganda made it seem like these places were resettlement centers or work camps, and the brutal orientation experience was just the beginning of the horrors of Nazi treatment. As the trains reached the camps, people would see tall guard towers, where armed guards and watchtowers surveillanced the camps and surrounding areas. The new arrivals would also see the layers of barbed wire fencing that would make it impossible to escape once they were inside. They'd meet SS officers, dressed in black uniforms with swastika armbands. These were the people that oversaw the camps, and would skip introductions to perform selection, the selection process that would mean life or death for the new arrivals. If you were fit for labor, you went one way, and if you weren't, you were as good as dead. It was pretty common for families to arrive together, but be split up during this cruel selection process. For many people, it would be the last time they saw their loved ones. Prisoners lost everything that made them individuals, such as their clothing, valuables, identification, and sometimes even hair. To further dehumanize the arrivals, guards issued everyone identical prison uniforms. Of course, they still needed to be able to tell the prisoners apart, so the Nazis assigned people numbers that they tattooed on their arms. They also put these numbers on their uniforms, with a flag underneath that identified which group the prisoners belonged to. That way, guards knew exactly which way to humiliate and belittle you. When these arrivals saw their new homes, they were greeted with overcrowded and unsanitary barracks, which were breeding grounds for diseases. This would also be when they would see other prisoners. The people that had been there for a while had somewhat adjusted to the grueling schedule that the Nazis subjected them to. They were awoken between 4 and 4:30 a.m., and given only 30 minutes to use the bathroom, get dressed, and make their beds. It wasn't easy to get everything done in time, especially when 2,000 prisoners shared the bathroom facilities. Guards punished anyone that wasn't ready in time. Once prisoners completed their morning tasks, they went outside for roll call. The weather was usually very harsh and the uniforms didn't protect people from the cold. After the morning roll call, prisoners headed on foot to their work assignments. During their journeys, officers made them sing insulting songs about themselves or other inmates for their own amusement. Anyone who couldn't keep up or disobeyed orders was beaten or tortured. By the time they reached their work location, the prisoners would be exhausted, Unfortunately, the day had just begun, and they spent hours performing physically demanding tasks while being weakened by severe malnourishment and disease. Their work hours fluctuated, and sometimes officers made them stay longer to exhaust them. After a grueling journey back to camp, people gathered for the evening roll call. It was common for there to be less prisoners in the evening than there were in the morning. That's because conditions were so bad that people died throughout the day, as a result of starvation, exhaustion, dehydration, or catching diseases due to their weakened immune systems. The prisoners that survived the day were forced to carry their diseased fellow inmates so they could be counted. After the roll call, they had some free time, if you can call it that. By that point in the day, people were so drained that they collapsed from exhaustion, or desperately tried to get their hands on extra food as they were starving. Lights out happened at 9 p.m., and in the morning, the routine started over again. Some of the forced labor these exhausted prisoners performed was to help the German war effort. Since so many men were drafted to fight in World War II, the country experienced labor shortages. And since Germany took many prisoners of war from countries like Poland and Russia, Nazis had a large workforce to exploit. Forced labor camp workers helped keep the economy afloat, but since there was such an influx of inmates, Nazis saw everyone as replaceable. It didn't matter if people's bodies were shutting down due to exhaustion, or that they were suffering from debilitating dehydration or starvation. Their attitude was that if one prisoner died, they wouldn't have to look far to replace them. We mentioned that the Nazis would take prisoners of war during their invasions. When Hitler advanced in another country, he would call for the creation of transit camps. These were locations to hold people until Nazis could transport them to concentration camps. We also spoke about the selection process earlier on, and how people's lives were in the SS officers' hands. This is because of extermination camps. If you went to a concentration camp, your chances of dying were pretty high. At an extermination camp, it was almost guaranteed. People destined for extermination camps were forced into overcrowded trains. They spent hours or even days cramped together in sealed train cars. When they exited, they were greeted by SS officers. The sick, elderly, young, and others deemed unfit for manual labor were almost immediately sent directly to their deaths. But they didn't know that. The victims thought they were showering before they entered camp. Guards instructed them to take their clothes off and head into what looked like showering facilities. They were not. The doors were closed and gas was released in the room, killing everyone inside. Nazi hell ended in 1945, when the Allied forces liberated concentration camps and Nazi Germany surrendered. It was only then that the world learned the true horrors the prisoners endured. The Nazi regime destroyed the lives of millions of people, separated families, and forced prisoners to live in unfathomable conditions. By the time the world discovered how atrocious this hell was, most of the people who endured it were dead.